That trade-off turned out to be a mirage. It turned out that it was an effect of short-term phenomena, and that in the long run the Phillips curve was vertical, so that in the long run there was no trade-off. You could have high inflation and high unemployment at the same time, as you did in the 1970s during the period of stagflation. The other curve involved is a curve of my good friend John Taylor, who is sitting at the table here with me, and he produced an analysis about the relationship between the variance of prices, the fluctuations in prices, the variance in prices on the one hand, and the variance in unemployment, well, not unemployment, but it comes to the same thing, in monetary and economic growth on the other. So you could have a choice. You could have, on this basis, if you have a highly variable inflation, that would enable you to have relatively stable economic growth. So you would have a trade-off to choose. You can have either instability in the economy with relatively low and steady inflation, or you could have instability in inflation with rather low and steady economy. That is a theoretical analysis of it. It turns out empirically that if you look at the actual variability of inflation and the variability of the economy, that they go together and not negative. The more variable the monetary, more variable prices and more variable inflation, the more unstable the economy, and vice versa. That's because the changes that are produced in monetary policy were not done historically in order to give you stable economies, but were done for a variety of reasons and themselves produced instability in the economy. Hence, historically, there has not only been no trade-off, but on the contrary, the stabler inflation, that is a stabler monetary policy, the stabler the economy. As a result, I argued that the kind of trade-off talked about was wholly different in the two cases. In the case of the Phillips curve, the trade-off was an empirical phenomenon based on empirically observed data. In the Phillips curve case, the trade-off was an analytical construct based on the logic underlying the curve for a country which had perfect monetary policy. And that's the main point of my paper, is simply to stress the difference between the two kinds of trade-offs. And I think I've said everything that's necessary for a discussion. I'll quit right there.
Okay, well, I should make a few remarks, Robert? Okay. So, first of all, many of you have seen the complete paper that Milton has written, including the charts, and I just want to say, to me, it's a fascinating comparison of newer research and research that he had so much to do with in terms of establishing the lack of stability of the Phillips curve, a prediction that was made before it was shown to be unstable, and one of the great contributions in economics. But to compare that with the more recent research, it seems to me, is fascinating. I also think the paper, by looking at the data of the variability of money growth and the variability of inflation and the variability of GDP, tells you a lot about why the performance of, in this case, the U.S. economy, but other economies, has improved so much in the last 15 or 20 years, and how it is ultimately traced to somehow more stable monetary policy. The points that I would mention in responding to some of the points that Milton raised is, first, I agree wholeheartedly that conceptually the variability trade-off that I worked on many years ago, the '79 paper, is different conceptually than the Phillips curve trade-off. It requires the manipulation, if you like, of estimated coefficients using economic theory to get that trade-off. So it's a transformation of estimated regression coefficients that come from the data. Whereas the original Phillips curve and the use of it as a trade-off was more directly related to statistical correlations and regression coefficients. And visually, of course, you can see that by looking at the inflation rates and the levels of unemployment, and just as Phillips originally did, to see these curves in the data. So conceptually it's different. It's a more direct relationship in the case of the Phillips curve than the variability curve that I worked on. It seems to me, in some sense, though, this has some advantages to it, because it's really using the theory, in my case, to derive a trade-off, and therefore, hopefully, a more stable trade-off than in the case the way the Phillips curve was originally used. And in fact, I think it has proved more stable and has remained as a good framework for evaluating monetary policy. Indeed, one of the first uses of this framework for evaluating policy was to show that a fixed money growth rule is the kind that Milton advocated many, many years ago, outperformed the U.S. economy up until the period where I wrote that paper through the late 70s. So clearly dominated the existing performance, and that was derived through this framework. One of the worries that Milton raises in his paper is that because the variability trade-off depends so much on the theory and on the model, that it's going to largely depend on which model you use. And it certainly does depend on the model. It's a transformation. It's using theory. It's a transformation of parameters in a model. However, it seems to me that other people who have tried to derive this trade-off with frameworks somewhat different than the one I did come up with similar kinds of calculations. So I view it as always in economics, of course, you have to make approximations, but it seems to me that's approximation that has been fairly accurate. Probably the most important comment I have has to do with the trade-off that I focused on having to be a frontier, like a production possibility frontier, if you like, whereas the original Phillips curve trade-off didn't have that same concept. So there would be no reason to think of policy yielding results always on, or even near for that matter, a trade-off curve, because all the points to the right, in my case, and above are possible to happen. I consider them inefficient. And so you could imagine over time, or comparing different countries, that you'd see a pattern which was positively sloped, as Milton has pointed out, rather than negatively sloped, as in the trade-off curve. And so indeed, as people have observed the important improvement in policy, in performance, it's interpreted as movements from inefficient sets to more efficient, that is closer to the frontier, and therefore you have not a contradiction of the theory, but in some sense it's neither a contradiction nor confirmation, I should say. It's something that's consistent. The observations are consistent with the theory as interpreted. So those would be my main points. I think this approach has proved to be an improvement over the original Phillips curve, and are, more generally speaking, the way of evaluating policy. It is obviously not something that's going to last forever, but since I did this amazingly 6 years ago, the fact that it's still working is not so bad. So thank you.
Well, I'm not sure whether it's still working, John. If we look at the evidence, we find a positive relation between the variability of inflation and the variability of output. And that's because the one function that the central banks have is to keep price levels relatively stable. And from my point of view, there's no trade-off in the sense that there's only one real function for the Federal Reserve and for central banks in general, and that's to have stable prices. And there are other forces that are affecting the economy. There are other things that will make the economy go up or down, which monetary policy can have nothing to do with. What monetary policy can do is to keep prices stable. And there's only you can only have one major objective. You can't have more than one. You convert a so-called dual objective into one objective by giving weights to them. So you're 60% inflation, 40% output. So the point I would make, by comparison, was that I do not want policy to try to follow the Taylor curve. I want policy to follow the rule that price level stability. I say the rule, the objective of price level stability.
I think there's a temptation, if you think about a trade-off curve like this, to go in the direction of fine-tuning and trying to move away from the goal of controlling inflation or price stability. But on the other hand, I think it reminds you that and central bankers, if there's too much of a focus on a single inflation number with too narrow a band, that the instrument of policy might actually move around too much to achieve that goal. So in one way to interpret the trade-off curve in the sense of when policy is on it, as distinct from moving towards it, is that it's a reminder to policymakers to have if you like, a range if they're targeting inflation, so 1 to 2, 1 to 3%, or if they're not numerically targeting it, not to focus on something that keeps the inflation rate, say on a month-to-month basis at a certain level. So in a way, it's a reminder not to overdo it, but to look at the goal of inflation not on a month-to-month, maybe not even on a quarter-to-quarter, but on a longer basis. And it seems to me it's useful in that respect as well. But I agree with you, there's a concern whenever you have both the output and the inflation in the objective function to move into a fine-tuning mode where you're emphasizing output stabilization too much, and that leads to the terrible outcomes that we experienced during the Great Inflation period.